50s, there was what they called La Violenza, and it was kind of a coup of a military junta. There's no evidence that the U.S. was involved, but you can kind of connect dots. But nobody's saying the U.S. was involved. But the these military juntas installed a right wing dictatorship in Colombia, and eventually that right wing dictatorship went crazy, and the U.S. started opposing it. And it was in the '60s that under the Kennedy administration, the U.S. wanted to do this thing called the Alliance for Progress, and part of that it was all to de-lefticize, to make up a word, South America, and to make it, because there's the whole Cold War stuff. There's a lot of leftist fear mongering. But they decided that under Plan Lauza, which was specific for Colombia, that they were going to install a compliant dictatorship. So that's where you began to have CIA operations going into peasant villages and massacring the entire population. And even in like credible media, they describe those peasants who were largely unarmed as terrorists, and the security forces that go in to quell them as just violent cops. But there's still a legitimacy thing. So that's where you begin to see a lot of the power taken away from the people. In the '70s, you see a lot of neoliberal prescriptions for Colombia, and that's where you have like the stealing of resources, and the whole point is to get Colombia into the whole neoliberal order where you have trade at really low costs. So throughout the '70s and up until the '80s, you have all these neoliberal prescriptions for the economy. In the '90s, you start seeing that intervention in Colombia is done on the pretense of the war on drugs. So the war on drugs is the reason why we fund their security forces, why we suppress their people. And after 9/11, that changes to a counter-terrorist goal. So these are all, the point I'm trying to make is there's always an excuse why the U.S. funds their security forces, why the U.S. sells arms to a country, especially in this case, Colombia, is they're all pretenses for suppressing the population. So I left out the graph here, but you see that there is a bell curve similar to the Haiti one of, as they're doing all these prescriptions, the funding goes up and it peaks about like late 2000s, early 2010s. And as they think that they have Colombia completely submissive, they start loosening the funding, and that's where, next slide. And so these are a lot of the organizations that they do funding. So in their appropriations bill of the U.S., they have funding specifically for countries. So you can see some of that funding, and as of right now, it's like $500 million. But all these organizations have unmarked amounts of money going to places like Colombia, Haiti, like everywhere, and you can't find numbers for that. Like it's just a black box of money. So on paper, they're funding security forces and arms sales to the tune of about $1 billion a year, but it could be more, and there is just no way to tell.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch a little bit more on Plan Colombia, which is the 21st century aid package that's being sent to Colombia. So it was originally envisioned by the Clinton and implemented by the Clinton administration in 2000. And its original stated goal was that of counter narcotics in the drug war of the 90s. But then we later see a shift in narrative towards counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. First, obviously, with 9/11, but then they shift stories on the ground and make up complete lies and fabrications of what happens in Colombia. So one example, and this is from John Lindsay Poland's book, Plan Colombia, of where there was a FARC raid on this government base, And the story was that they were completely overrun and like everyone in the base was killed. And if they had just more like equipment and guns, and they could have like won it out. But that didn't happen. It was just basically a stalemate. There was a battle, but there's the shifting of these stories in order to fit the narrative that we need more weapons, we need more guns, in order to gain like political control and complete order over the country. And so Plan Colombia would achieve this goal of sending a ton of weapons over to Colombia. And as Alexander said, there was this huge amount of guns sent around the 2010s, and then it kind of decreases. But what is really important is as it decreases, because Colombia is so used and relies on these guns that were sent in the previous decade, that as the deliveries decreases and aid decreases, gun sales actually increases because they need this continual flow of weapons and ammunition into the country. So it's kind of like another form of imperialism where you're expanding markets and gaining reliance on some sort of commodities, but in this case it's with lethal aid. And so what are the consequences of this aid? And I've separated it into three realms of the military actions, the police actions, and paramilitary actions against indigenous and land defenders. So for the military, the biggest scandal that they were involved in was called the false positive scandal, which was a scandal from 2002 to 2008 in which they killed around 6,402 people extrajudicially. And so basically what was part of Plan Colombia and the U.S. aid packages where they would give salary bonus incentives to increase the number of guerrillas of being killed. So what they would do, what the Colombian officers would do is they would just dress civilians in guerrilla fatigues and uniforms and have them killed. But actually they wouldn't even get the order correct. Like later examiners who were able to reveal the scandal realized that there weren't any bullet holes in the uniforms, and they were just dressing them up later. And that's how part of this scandal was revealed. And documents from the National Security Archive have shown that the U.S. and U.S. officials were aware of what they call body count mentality and body count tactics from the Colombian military already in the 90s, and then they went ahead with these programs and further incentivized extra killings of like civilians just to cause more death and destruction. And on my next slide, we'll go into the other two realms. So for police, of course, they have a huge police brutality problem in Colombia, but the main unit that I would focus on was the SMAD unit, which is a special riot police control unit that was formed in 1999. And right away, they started seeing like deaths. So in 2001 was their first death, and they would later get waves of deaths. Maybe, I think there was like 6 in 2005 and then 7 in 2007 or something. And like it would get increasingly deadlier until 2019, when there was, I think, like 22 deaths or around 20, and then 2021 there were like 44 deaths from this police unit. And we see this increasing lethality rate of this police unit, and their funding never ceased in any of U.S. administration and programs. Their funding kept increasing despite calls to decrease the funding because of this lethality rate. And not just deaths, but they were involved in just brutality and injuring of the thousands of people. There were over 1,000 incidents of like police brutality just in this unit alone. And now on to paramilitary. So the paramilitaries have long existed in Colombia, and specifically the right-wing militaries under the AUC were actually declared a terrorism organization by the United States. But many of their successor organizations and the AUC have been revealed to have been funded by many Colombian businesses, local businesses, but also foreign corporations, including Chiquita, which was able to fund these paramilitary forces to kill like labor union leaders, peasant organizers, and of course indigenous land defenders. And this was revealed in documents and how they were able to use the Convivir program, which is a government surveillance, or it's a government-sanctioned surveillance program, and they're able to transfer funds into these paramilitary groups. So what this shows is that, one, these corporations were able to fund these paramilitary groups, but also that the Colombian government was allowing for this funding to happen, and there's an implicit support of these paramilitary groups with this program. And Alvaro Uribe was quoted saying was quoted supporting this program, and so there's the support of these paramilitaries. And the result of these paramilitary deaths is it's really hard to find exactly their exact impact, because a lot of indigenous deaths go unnoticed and unclaimed. But there's these statistics that I found from 2012 to 2020. There are 117 indigenous killings, and this is despite the peace and reconciliation process that has happened in Colombia, and it just really goes to show that there are just so many just successor groups out there that are willing to extort, willing to go out and kill these people just to scare off labor, to scare off people out of their land, to further dispossess people, and to further capitalist accumulation. So that is what I've noticed.
And just to go back real quick, the Kennedy administration's Progress for Alliance, which sparked all this, was lobbied for by Chiquita and United Fruit. And the other lobby was the board of the Inter-America Foundation. So that's supposed to be it's supposed to be an NGO, non-government, and they're funding and approving these measures to go into sovereign peasant lands and just get them out by any means necessary. And usually that means death and body bags. And and then he mentioned FARC. That's the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. So that's the resistance group, and they're mostly unarmed peasants. They become more militarized, but in self-defense. So I just want to add that.
So maybe before we know, obviously we want to keep the flow. What's it? Yeah, absolutely. But just to see, our work is clearly the work is incomplete. There's a lot of countries right now that are on the front lines. I think Peru, more than any country right now, is on the front lines of resistance, indigenous resistance to yet another coup. And Honduras, the opening slide that we had of Berta Cáceres, who was an indigenous land defender, in case you don't know, was killed in Honduras after the U.S.-backed coup in 2009. So we and then this slide, I'm gonna some of our colleagues aren't here today. They're also looking at Mexico. So I'm gonna I think you've heard it for now, and because we've got other groups to present, but suffice it to say, Mexico shows a very similar pattern to Colombia and Haiti, especially when the Zapatista uprising was happening in the 90s and all the way up through the early 2000s. The Mexican military's equipment and funding was coming from the U.S. government, right? So, and as Alex and Joaquin were pointing out, it's also private sector funding. It's so key. Like Coca-Cola, I believe they were also funding the paramilitaries, and when the people were trying to unionize in a bottling plant in the 90s, and they were being gunned down. So when we look at our society, and right now they're debating the appropriations bill in Congress to yet another cycle of funding. This is, of course, we all get this. Like, if no country spends more on the military than the United States, that's just the U.S. military. 800 bases, especially surrounding China. But oh my God, here comes a balloon, shoot it down, right? But it's ridiculous. And then on the other hand, but all of this isn't even in the military budget. This is a completely separate line item, weaponizing and funding all these other. So. Any questions for folks before we transition to the next team?
Question. I was wondering right now that you guys were saying Mexico, if there was some sort of relation or it became up the arm of cartels through open sales of weapons in the U.S. Because perhaps it's not government to government, right? But open and free
Right.
sale of weapons from the border states, like the Fast and Furious operation
Yeah.
in the U.S. for
Yeah, it's
example.
actually on the. Yeah.
So I was wondering if
Yeah.
that came up in your.
Can you yeah? You guys want
We could just say, we're putting up a video
The
of
next
John
slide after-
Holland,
after
who
Mexico.
wrote extensively about that, and
Okay.
who has really U.S. Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico.org. And there's a video all about it, and it's the Border Patrol plus CIA allowing weapon sales, just like you're saying, across the border, allowing it, facilitating it, making it possible so that they could so-called track the narco violence, and in so doing, basically arranging the transport of weapons to instigate massive warring among different cartel groups. And so that is documented, yeah. Thank you for that.
But it's hard too, like you're saying. You're like we used a website called securityassistance.org that shows in theory it shows all the amount of private weapons that the U.S. government is authorizing, right? So like if Lockheed Martin wants to sell missiles to Saudi Arabia, it still has to be authorized by the U.S. government, and so it should count for the private sector, but it's often very hard. Yeah, yeah.
You may not know the answer to this question, but maybe a question for the room, actually. What do we do with this information? Yes.
Can I make one point? Well, these are really crucial, I think, to understand a pattern of U.S. imperialism, like how it's been operating. But really interestingly, Colombia and Mexico are two places where they've recently had elections that are now really shifting things. So it's people who are fed up with it, who saw it, who have resisted that. And so, like Alexander was talking about, you now have Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez that have done an entire peace process, which now is coming to fruition. So a major transformation is happening in Colombia right now. And the same is happening with AMLO. AMLO has brought about the Morena Party, which is now doing popular education and popular power all throughout Mexico, has denounced neoliberalism flat out. And, you know, there's a lot of attack on AMLO right now because, and people were really suspect of AMLO at the beginning.
Yeah.
But now AMLO is like down and saying that he's down. And so this is part of a whole regional reintegration of what the Americas will look like when it doesn't need the US anymore at all. So that currency that you're talking about,
The sur.
is huge. So you have groups like CELAC, groups like UNASUR. They are the formation of the independent Latin America and the Caribbean that is saying we're going to be in a multipolar world doing trade across the globe, and we are going to reject the Monroe Doctrine of the United States of America and live with our own sovereign and regional integration and plurinationalism, which is to say our nations are not going to be defined by these political agreements that were made with European colonialism. We are going to respect the nationalism, sovereignties, peoples of this region outside of these nation states. So it's actually really powerful. I think what's happening, Mexico and Colombia, I think are examples where that transformation is taking place. Peru and Haiti, in my opinion, Honduras, we're going to hear from very, very soon, are examples of where Honduras has Xiomara Castro, so we're going to learn about that. But Guatemala, yeah. These are really front line where the U.S. has exacted their coup. They've done that coup, and their people are being killed right now. So that's the.
I kind of want to touch on that question again, but domestically.
Oh, please.
One of the things that I start to do in the report that I just finished is doing a comparison of the